South Africa and its citizens are struggling to make ends meet. The nation's inflation is already at a 13-month high, biting deep into the country's economy. On the other hand, from Africa's most industrialized nation to its largest economy, Nigeria's central bank is clamping down on unregistered associations and societies. Is this a revenue drive or a large threat to the nation's fiscal policies? We will get into the details on the show, and after that, we will be taking a look at a rising star in a tech space, and that would be on women in business. And we will be having a compact show today. You are welcome. This is Business Edge. I am Lekon Nobanjo. So right now, let's start with the African business headlines. British International Investment PLC, the UK government development finance arm, plans to invest $6 billion over the next 5 years in Africa in areas ranging from renewable power and digital infrastructure to support women-owned businesses. The spending, which is part of a $10 billion global program, including a $76 million contribution towards a planned $500 million fund, is being raised by Old Mutual Limited's African Infrastructure Investment Managers that was announced on Wednesday. The International Monetary Fund's Executive Board recognized Egypt's continued vulnerability from a high public debt burden and a considerable gross financing requirement in an assessment of a $5.2 billion standby agreement reached with Egypt in 2020. The board issued a statement in which it stated that decisive progress on deeper fiscal and structural reforms is needed to raise the economy's competitiveness, improve governance, and build its resilience against shocks. According to the statement, reforms should lessen the role of the state and promote the growth of the private sector. South African stocks closed higher on Tuesday, led by fashion and grocery retailers, which reported better than expected sales growth. Retailers' results eased investor concerns about constrained consumer spending in an environment where rising inflation, interest rates, fuel, and utilities are putting pressure on household disposable income. The Kenya Electricity Generating Company said it injected an extra 86 megawatts of power into the national grid for its geothermal plant on Tuesday. KenGen, which produces the bulk of Kenya's electricity, generates 799 megawatts from geothermal steam, which is found deep underground the Rift Valley and is used to drive large turbines that generate the power. It has a total installed capacity of 1,904 megawatts, with the rest coming from dams and wind farms. And that's all on business headlines for this morning. We quickly go on a break, and when we return, we will get into our first topic for today. In June, South Africa's annual consumer price inflation came in at 7.4%, its highest level in 13 years. It is an increase from 6.5% in May and from 5.9% in April and March. According to Statistics SA, the main drivers of the country's inflation in June were food, non-alcoholic beverages, housing and utilities, transport, and miscellaneous goods, including services. Particularly concerning was the rise in the cost of transportation. It was up by 20% year on year. This means that if you commute costs 10 Rand in June last year, it will cost about 12 Rand in June this year, putting it in a very approximate way. And so joining me from Pretoria, South Africa, is Patrick Kelly, Chief of Price Statistics South Africa. It's a beautiful morning to you, Kelly. Thanks so much for joining us on Business Edge.
Thank you for having me. Good to be with you.
All right, so consumer price inflation is calculated using basket of goods, and the items in each country's basket varies, of course, according to what we know. So let's look at South Africa and put it in context. What is actually in its basket?
Yeah, well, perhaps just to take one step back, that the CPIs aim to represent the kind of aggregates of all households in the country. So it's not trying to simulate the spending patterns of any particular household. And so when we compile the basket, we really have a very wide envelope, if you like, of different goods and services that households across different income spectrums, different geographic areas would use. So currently we have 415 different products and services in the basket, and these range all the way from food and drinks, alcoholic beverages, tobacco, housing costs, utilities, clothing, personal care items, as well as services like cell phones or telecommunications, television services, insurance, financial services, funeral costs are also in there. So it's really a very, very wide range of different products, most of these which we measure the prices of on a monthly basis.
So basically, the basket of goods South Africa uses to measure inflation, and of course, the basket of goods purchased by households every month definitely would vary and would not be identical, if I'm to deduce from what you've said. But then tell us, is it possible that inflation for some people could be lower and for others it could be higher?
Yes, absolutely. So in addition to the basket of goods and services, we attach a weight to each of those items. And that weight indicates its kind of relative importance and impact on the overall headline rate of inflation. So we do calculate, for example, different inflation rates for different provinces, as well as for different income groups. So if we just take income groups as a case, we could look at the poorer sections of the community would spend a far higher proportion of their household budget on food items compared to those who are more wealthy. And so at the moment, because we do see food inflation higher than the average rate of inflation, the poor are experiencing much higher rates. So for example, if I was just to look, the poorest sections of the community are kind of around 9%, 8-9% inflation, whereas the more affluent communities are experiencing inflation more or less around the average of 7.4, 7.5%.
All right, let's go regional now. I'm talking about inflation figures. Would you say there are disparities in the region? And of course, which regions would you say are the hardest hit?
Yeah, so again, it relates very much to the kind of weightings. I think that we don't have massive discrepancies in terms of the actual price levels that are paid across the country. But typically what we're seeing is that provinces that have got bigger rural areas, more people living in rural areas, do experience higher rates of inflation. So if we were to break it down a little bit, we see that Mpumalanga and Limpopo, which are two predominantly rural provinces, have inflation rates of close to 8%, whereas the Western Cape, which is much more urbanized and probably the most affluent per capita province in the country, has an inflation rate of about 7.1% at the moment.
All right, before we do a bit of comparison between inflation in the year 2008 to 2009 compared to now, I'd like you to look at some other bodies like the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group measure inflation, which of course gives different figures compared to other figures that we have gotten so far. Now, why is there this sort of disparity in terms of figures given by different bodies or different metrics? And is it normal? And what impact do you think it will have on the economy? Because when we have this multiple kind of inflation figures, it could be some sort of confusion within the mix.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I absolutely think that additional data is always of value. What we really do need to understand is the different methodologies that are used to compile those figures, as well as their objectives. So if I just talk about the CPI for a moment, as I mentioned earlier, we have over 415 items in the basket. The aim of the CPI is to represent aggregate households in the country. And the CPI is used both to kind of assess changes in the cost of living of households, but also as a macroeconomic indicator that the central bank would use to adjust inflation rates when it feels inflation is going too high. The Pietermaritzburg Group, for example, they're really focused on issues of economic justice and the impact of price changes on the poor. So they have a very different methodology as well as a different objective. They have approximately 60 to 70 items in their basket. the items tend to be kind of, let me say, more bulk volumes. So whereas we might measure let's say, a 1 liter or 2 liter bottle of oil, they might measure a 5 liter bottle of oil, whereas we might measure a 2.5 kg a bag of milli meal, they might measure a 25 kg a bag of milli meal. They employ women from poor communities to go and collect the data. And what they try to do is to simulate the purchasing habits of those poor households. So on a whole range of methodological processes and principles, they are very different. And I think that, they just give a different insight into what's happening in different communities.
All right, talking about different insights and different situation or different scenario, as we look to put it, between 2008, 2009 and now, what would you say the differences are in terms of the figures? What did South Africa government do right or wrong as at that time? What lessons can be drawn to help reduce the level of inflation that occurs in the country now?
Yeah, so if we want to take a little bit of a historic look at things, perhaps even before 2008, I went back and just took a look at when was the highest inflation rate that we had experienced, and that was in 1986. It was just over 20%. 1986 was really the height of pressure against the apartheid government, massive international sanctions and the like. So that was the context then. More recently, in 2008 was the kind of the highest peak that we've experienced. That inflation in May 2009 was actually a slight slowing down from a peak in August 2008, where we reached just under 14%. Now, we can think back to that period of time. It was really around the global financial crisis. And in particular, an impact of the global financial crisis in South Africa was a depreciation of the currency against other international benchmarks, particularly the dollar. And so this had a much more widespread impact on price increases than we are seeing now. And it had, in fact, because inflation had been high for a kind of extended period of time, this was beginning to find its way through into services prices and quite high wage settlements, which obviously has a knock-on impact on the price of many other items. So we did see quite a different scenario at that point in time. How it compares to where we are now, I think, is that we're seeing inflation being focused very much in fuel prices and food prices. And, historically, another factor that has influenced inflation in South Africa has been weather conditions, and particularly drought conditions. And this was something we experienced kind of between 2014 and 2016, which was probably, looking back again, a period of relatively high inflation rates. So at the moment, we do not have drought conditions. In fact, we have a very good rainfall. And so we can attribute what's going on at the moment really to international factors. There has been some supply constraints that are still a hangover from COVID. The Russian invasion of the Ukraine has had a massive impact on international food prices. And there are also weather conditions that even go back before COVID, for example, in countries that grow a lot of palm oil, produce a lot of palm oil, have impacted on cooking oil prices.
Oh, okay.
So these are some of the differences that we could identify between 2009 and today's inflation.
Well, of course, it's a shocking reality for South Africans and, of course, the country's economy, as it is with other economies of the world. But then, Kelly, we quickly run off on a break. And when we return, we get to look at what adjustments can be made to help South Africa navigate through those stormy waters. I'll be back with you in a bit. Now, in South Africa, prices of food and non-alcoholic beverages increased by 8.6% year-on-year in June. And this is the highest annual rate for food and NAB since March 2017. The main groups contributing to high food inflation in June 2020 were bread, cereals, we talk about meat, oils, and fats. So Can any sort of adjustments be made on the part of the government and the citizens in order for them to be able to face these stark realities and get out of it? We quickly go on a break now, and when we return, the conversation will continue. The price of bread, prices of staples, transport, fuel, and some other essential commodities have shot up as of now. And the question that so many people are asking is that, can South Africans cope with this reality? And still with me on the show is Patrick Kelly, Chief of Price Statistics, Statistics South Africa. Thanks for staying with us, Kelly. And let's continue with the conversation. Do you think that we could see some sort of leveling up of the inflation in terms of a reduction in inflation if the right parameters are put in place? Because as of what we know is as high as 11.27%. So do you think that we can be optimistic enough thinking that if the right things are put in place, there could be a reduction in the inflation?
I mean, first of all, let me just say that as Stacey say, we don't make policy prescriptions or proposals. But so let's take a look at what is really driving inflation at the moment. We do have very, very high fuel costs, which are running at about 45% year-on-year increases, as well as the sorts of items that you've mentioned in the food basket are really the staple items, grain products, cooking oils, and margarine, which are based on grain products as well, and meat. And meat is typically, although it's animals are fed with grain products. And we can track these back to the fact that these are really easily tradable in the international trade arena. So the oil price and the petrol price in South Africa is determined by a formula that looks at the crude oil price as well as the exchange rate to the dollar. And until the overall international oil price comes down or there was a dramatic improvement in the exchange rate, the petrol prices are not likely to come down significantly. But just looking forward, these were the June figures that we published most recently. In July, the petrol price went up, so that would add further pressure on the upside. But in August, they are predicted to come down slightly, looking at current estimates. So that would provide some relief to the overall inflation rate. Food prices, I think that we can look internationally, and there has been some indication that international prices are starting to moderate. There has been publicity recently around an agreement between Russia and the Ukraine to export wheat from the Ukraine. And this will certainly help to lower the overall international prices. I have also noticed that imported oil seeds coming into South Africa from other countries have dropped a little bit in price in May. And so this could possibly lead to some softening of the inflation rates for cooking oils and fats. So I think that we very much do need to look at these international features to get a reading on it. We have also seen in South Africa the central bank increasing interest rates. Their goal is to try to ensure that there's not a sustained increase in the rate of inflation. So when I was reflecting back on 2013, 2008 to 9 experience, the inflation rates had passed through very much through wage increases and other demand. And I think that probably the Reserve Bank would be keen to try and limit the increase in inflation and not let it flow through to kind of increased demand situation.
Okay, so finally, on the side of the citizens now, in terms of income, buying and spending power, what sort of adjustments would you recommend to help them, of course, mitigate the situation, get through?
Yeah, look, I mean, I guess each household has its own circumstances and their priorities. I think that what's really important is that inflation is at the moment focused on certain product groups, and as much as households are able then to substitute away from those particular groups, Perhaps looking at cheaper sources of protein. For example, rice has not increased as much as, for example, maize meal or wheat has increased. So there may be some opportunities for households there. Clearly, as interest rates increase, that puts further pressure on households' disposable income. And, I guess that people would look at their budgets to see how they can minimize the impact of interest rate increases on debt that they may have.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for joining the conversation. Really appreciate your resourcefulness.
Thank you very much. It was a good discussion. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Now, inflation has soared to the highest level in decades in many countries, fueled by the war in Ukraine, just as Kelly said, and the easing of COVID restrictions in so many countries. South Africa is not exonerated from the list. Well, with its central bank raising the benchmark interest rate by 0.5 percentage point to 4.75%, it is hoped that it will help the economy weather the coronavirus pandemic and the economic situation there. So let's quickly go on another break, and when we return, we will bring you international business news. Don't go away.